Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the third and final advisory panel meeting. First off, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm on Darug land today. That's just west of Sydney in the Blue Mountains. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians and show our respect for elders past, present, emerging, any that might be present today, and of course, any that are going to be watching this recording, which is my note to say that we will be recording today's session. Cameras on. We love to see everyone's faces. It happens so rarely these days that we get to meet face to face, or that's coming back a little bit. I mean, everyone knows the rules now. Mute yourself, chuck your names on Zoom if you could, so we know who's talking. Yeah, and I just wanted to move into a bit of a thank you to the panel, the advisory panel. We've for your help in getting our data collection all done. So I know there was a lot of back and forth in terms of actually getting all our final data sets from many of you, and so thank you for that. I know that was a painful process in some ways. And also thank you to the participants in the trial ratings. So I was up at Bayview last week on one of the trial ratings, having a bit of a look around. We find that that's really interesting and really good in helping us actually understand the sector and the actual buildings themselves. So the purpose of today is to update you on where we're up to in developing the rating for residential aged care and retirement living. We are going to discuss the outcomes of the benchmarking. We're going to get your inputs on the development of the rules. And we're also going to update you on how the trial ratings are going and what's actually going to happen next, because we're kind of in the last exciting phase really of development of this rating. And, you know, in the coming months, we'll have a real product in market that, that you'll be using. So it's great. A few introductions. So I'm James Elks. I'm Head of Product Development at NABERS. And I realized, of course, on the last advisory panel meeting that we perhaps had not given enough of an introduction to the people we've partnered with to develop this rating, which is Delta Q, which is yourselves, but which is also Delta Q. So today on the call, we've got Paul. Paul is actually the primary technical author of the original NABERS energy and water ratings. He's since developed hotels, shopping centres, apartment buildings, data centres, and the international NABERS variations in the UK and also in New Zealand. And he's on the ACT Climate Change Council. So Paul Bannister. Also with Paul, we've got Grace Fu. Grace is Principal Consultant at Delta Q. She's been involved in NABERS for over a decade. And she's got all sorts of incredible certifications like EEC Energy Efficiency Leader. Grace, probably many of you have had a chat to Grace. She leads the team at Delta Q who are developing the residential aged care and retirement living rating tool. So today, I sort of told you what we're going to do. It's up on the screen. I'm going to hand off to Supra now to give a bit of a brief recap on where we're up to. And then after that, he's going to hand over to Paul and Grace. And also just note that we'll hand out these slides later. So if there's anything in there you need, we'll send it to you. And of course, any questions, please put them in the chat. Like Carlos mentioned, we've got plenty of the NABERS team here today, so we'll be able to answer even your wildest questions. So go nuts. Over to you, Supra.
Awesome, thanks, James. And just as an FYI, the slides are attached to the calendar invite. So if you want to have a look and have that open on the side, feel free to do that. So I'll start with a quick overview or a quick recap of NABERS. So we are a national government program that rates the operational performance of buildings on a star rating scale. Operational performance primarily includes energy ratings and water ratings. And all of our ratings are also based on data that is measurable and can be independently verified. We are on a star rating scale, which is a very easy to understand and communicate metric where 0 or 1 star indicates poor performance and highlights a lot of scope of improvement. And a 6-star rating scale indicates market leading performance. And we are there present in different building sectors like offices, shopping centers, and some other sectors as well. As part of our strategic plan, one of our goals is to expand NABERS to all major building types and we are kicking that off with residential aged care and retirement living. And this is what the product development flow looks like. So we started off with data collection, which took a good chunk of last year. And then we've moved into the benchmarking, rules development, and trial ratings phase, which is a bit of an iterative process. On the benchmarking front, we presented on some of our initial findings in the previous advisory panel meeting and got a lot of your inputs and feedback. At the back of the meeting, we also got some additional data. And since then, we now have our draft benchmarks ready. And Delta Q will present on that in the next session. And then parallelly, we've also pursued the development of the rules document. This is really a document for our assessors who will be doing the rating assessments, and it provides the details of all the data that is required for doing the rating assessment. So we've put together some of those details together, and the idea is to hear from you and get your feedback and your inputs in helping us shape the rules as well. And then we've got the trial ratings, which is also ongoing at this stage, and many of you are participating. So we're looking at around 16 sites under this phase across Australia. Once we've completed the trial ratings, the outcome of those will help in or feed into finalizing the benchmarks and the rules process. And we'll also update quickly on that later on today as well. And then looking ahead, we've got the assessor training, so that the development and delivery, which will start May onwards, and then also the launch of the 2 rating products in the next couple of months or so. And we'll also briefly touch on these 2 items towards the end of this session as well. So that's me, and with that, I'll now hand over to Grace to get into the benchmarking. Grace, over to you.
Great, thank you. So thank you, the NABERS team, for introducing Paul and myself. Paul will be the silent and an active observer throughout this session. If you've got any questions or concerns, please feel free to post it on the chat, and Paul can respond if we're not able to see it throughout this session as well. So I'm first going to quickly run through, I guess, the concept of the 2 rating tools, what the coverage is, and then I'll run through what the benchmarking process entailed. So first things first is we have essentially 2 separate components of the residential aged care and retirement living sector. So we currently have the retirement living benchmark that considers all common facilities, which includes if you have a pool on site that's heated, if you have an on-site gym or fitness center for your residents, if you have a clubhouse, sometimes they call them community centers so that residents can use that. There may be a piano in there, a library, a common space where people can spend time together, and maybe a small kitchenette. All of that will be included within the retirement living rating tool. In a retirement living village, often you will have lots of street lights and perhaps bollards throughout the entire complex or facility. And all of the street lights will be included in the energy coverage as well. If you had an on-site heavy laundry facility where you do bed linen or towels for your residents, the energy consumption with that will be included. And that would include any facilities you might have on your retirement living facility, such as washers or dryers that's available to your residents, particularly residents who may live in assisted care facilities. All of that will be included within that call. If you had a kitchen that is on site where you cook hot meals for your residents, the energy consumption of that kitchen where you cater for meals for your residents will be included. Particularly if it's downstream of your meter. Where you have what we consider independent living units, for example, you've got villas, you've got townhouses, you may have apartment units where the energy consumption for that unit, we're classifying an independent unit, is connected to the residents themselves, and they pay for their own bills, they receive their own bills. the energy consumption that is rated under the retirement living tool excludes that energy consumption. And that would include both electricity and gas. However, for water, we're including everything that goes into the complex within the boundary of the site. Okay, and that includes water that is consumed by your independent units. So moving on to the residential aged care rating tool now. For residential aged care, it's a little bit more straightforward because we're including everything that is within the bounds of that residential aged care facility. So any facility within the building, such as consult rooms, you might have common areas, the actual bedrooms, maybe staff rooms, they're all included within the energy and water coverage. If you had an on-site laundry facility, if you had on-site catering facilities or a kitchen, everything is included within that boundary. Where you have a residential aged care facility that has a little bit of land around it, all of your street lights and water consumption for irrigation associated with that little bit of space will also be included within the residential aged care rating tool. Next slide. So thanks to many of you who's provided data across to us, we've used that data to conduct benchmarking. And essentially, benchmarking is a statistical process where we try to determine what variables impact the energy and water consumption for the coverage that I've just gone through in the previous slide at a site. What we're essentially doing is we're collecting all of your data, we're doing lots of scatter plots, graphing them in Excel or statistical software, to try to verify relationships between variables, particularly things that, say for example, the number of residents, and try to see what the impact and how much impact and the strength of that impact on the resultant energy and water consumption. So when I talk about energy, I'm talking about LPG, I'm talking about electricity, and I'm talking about gas as well. Once we've gone through that process, which is often iterative, we then create a resultant benchmark. And that benchmark then goes into the resultant rating tool, the NABERS rating tool, to generate your star rating system. And essentially, that's just an equation that expresses energy and water consumption as a function of those variables I just went through. When you get to the actual star rating, which is that 6-star rating scale, essentially what we're doing is to compare your actual site energy and water consumption to this predicted value that we've obtained as part of this benchmarking process. Next slide. So I might pause here for a short moment to see if we've got any questions regarding the concept of how we've approached this problem.
Wendy from QUT here. I have a question for clarification. Regarding kitchens where you said cooking meals, if kitchens were cooking meals, they were included, but otherwise they're not. What about kitchens that reheat meals and do light cooking, like morning tea, afternoon tea, baking type things?
Yep, that's a great question, and actually it was one that we just discussed today as well, Wendy. At the moment, we're taking the approach of hot meals being prepared, so a standard, let's call it the free veg and the meat, for example, that is included within that definition of meals catered on site. When we're talking about reheat of meals, because you've obtained your meal from an off-site facility, then unfortunately with the data set that we've got at the moment, we don't really have the statistical basis to do that correction. And I suspect it's going to be quite small anyway. The other option is we could consider looking out for benchmarks and do a deemed correction. But at this stage, the tendency is not to treat reheat on-site kitchens within the benchmark.
Wendy, one thing I will clarify is that any energy consumption that you use on site to reheat a meal, like let's say that you had a microwave, just to keep it really simple, that energy is included in the rating. So
Yep.
it's more about, are we going to create a correction factor to compare buildings based on the number of, meals reheated on site? So it's not about whether we're capturing that in the rating. It's more like, if we don't include a variable like that, our facilities that do that are going to get a significant penalty. Like all of them are going to get a really low star rating because that's something we didn't consider. So I think in this case is likely to be a smaller, a second order sort of issue. But often what we found in other rating tools, for example, is that a significant kitchen that feeds lots of people for multiple meals a week actually can be a meaningful percentage of your total energy consumption. So if you don't include it, you're comparing some sites that are still getting those meals but cooked somewhere else with the ones that do it on site. And so the energy is still being used somewhere, but it looks like some of those buildings are using a lot more energy just because they happen to have a really big cooking facility, sometimes something that may be shared with the community, for example. So those are the kind of things that we're looking for, things that if we don't consider them, we could have buildings getting a significant penalty in the rating. But in this case, I think we do think that it's unlikely that it's probably a relatively smaller issue. And also, as Grace mentioned, it's also the challenge with how do we get that kind of data verified on an annual basis, a little bit tricky as well.
Thank you.
There's another question on the chat box, which is how do we deal with on-site generation like solar PV? The response to that, Stephen, is essentially anything that is generated on site and then consumed on site essentially then means that you're importing less amount of grid electricity. And what we base our rating and what we are evaluating the rating against is your grid import. So which is why if you have on-site solar PV, then that reduces the electricity import, and then that reduces the total emissions and hence will have an impact, positive impact on the rating, or likely to have a positive impact.
Stephen, did that make sense? Great.
Perfect. We've got something come through from John with the definition of meals. John, would you like to take it yourself?
Yeah, just pointing out that different terminology is used. So just making sure that you have it clearly defined in the rules. So when they count it up, everyone's using the same approach. That's all.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we'll have the opportunities to refine the definition based on your input in the rules section of this session today.
By the way, and just to round that up, I think that's some of you have quite a bit of experience with NABERS in the past, and some of you are quite new to the program. And often what we look at this stage is, big variables, but then we're also working in parallel with the actual standard. How do you actually prove this in practice? And that document goes into a lot of detail and captures, a lot of nuance around, well, what happens if, this is a relatively fringe case, but it can happen in 3% of buildings. How do we treat it? Is that in or out? And so a lot of these, sometimes these questions are questions that, are relatively small when we're talking about the actual benchmarks, but they're really important when we're creating the standard, and we are putting a lot of time and effort into that standard as well. What are the specific things that we need to capture and to have consistency? I think that what you mentioned, John, about the meals is a really good example of that. We'll have to have a really clear definition. So, somebody eating an apple is not considered a meal, but somebody cooking a really big thing is. And so where is the, what is the definition that we apply? How do we actually ask people to, keep track of that around the year? What documentation do we use to prove that? So all of those are things that sort of usually live in the realms of what we call the rules, but really it's a standard document that usually somewhere between 60 to 100 pages.
Excellent. So hope that provided everyone with a relatively comfortable understanding of the approach that we've taken. There were a few items that were raised, and it's wonderful. Just hold that thought in your head as we go through the rest of the slides. We will have a rules section where we're hoping for lots of input from all of you. So let's give you a quick update on where we landed with the residential aged care, energy and water benchmark, as well as the retirement living energy and water benchmark. So we're starting off with the residential aged care energy rating on this slide at the moment. Our data set that was used for benchmarking comprised between about 120 sites. There were a few outliers and a few adjustments that we needed to make, which ended up being about 113 sites used for statistical benchmarking in the end. The key variable and the primary variable that's most important for this benchmark is the occupied bed days. It essentially helps to scale your energy consumption, or really we're talking about emissions here, greenhouse gas emissions of the facility. Once we've done the primary correction using occupied bed days, we then have secondary corrections, which are second order effects of other variables that may actually impact your site's energy usage. So the very first one that we have there is number of heating degree days. Essentially, the warmer the location or the climate of your site, then we'll expect the heating energy essentially to increase accordingly. In addition to that, we also found that pool surface area is a correction that is worthy of correcting. The key thing here is that within the data set and the pool surface area that was received for benchmarking didn't quite agree. Once we looked at international literature and papers which benchmark pool energy consumption, particularly related to how large that pool surface area is, what we obtained from the actual raw data didn't quite agree. So what we're using instead to ensure that the tool is robust and is able to translate back to what's actually happening in the physical world, we're using a DEEM pool surface area correction. Finally, we also found that with sites that had their on-site heavy laundry processes or facilities, were found to have a statistically significant or a high degree of, I guess, significance and certainty, confidence that a site with heavy laundry processing facilities has higher consumption. So there's a correction for that based on whether you have an on-site heavy laundry facility or if you process your heavy laundry off-site. So those are the 4 key variables for residential aged care corrections. Next slide. Now moving on to residential aged care water rating.
Grace, before you move
Grace,
on, my apologies, sorry, would you mind just explaining what a deemed pool surface area correction is?
Essentially what we're doing is we are saying for each surface area square meters of the pool, what is the kilogram CO2 that's expected to be consumed for that? I
think Alex's question might have been on what it actually deemed means versus, the standard adjustment would have made. And Alex, I think the answer is that we usually, for the most part, we take data and statistically determine, what does it mean to have a swimming pool? Oh, it means a building with a swimming pool, we use 4% more energy than one without it. We usually do that through data. The challenge with that is sometimes with some variables, especially when you get a lot of buildings that don't have swimming pools in this case, but some of them do have swimming pools. Sometimes the quality of the data that you get is not always that high. Like, for example, if somebody put a swimming pool was a 20 meter square surface and made a mistake and it said 30, right? When you have a small number of data points, it's actually really difficult to validate that. So we look at the statistics and we want what this data is telling us about the impact of swimming pools doesn't really make sense. So when we have those cases, what we usually do is when we have enough evidence to say, we know that swimming pools have an impact, but this data probably has some issues that we can't identify exactly what they are, probably like manual data entry issues in some sites. So what we do is we go, well, there's a lot of literature about what's actually used in the average pump in these climate zones and depending on the size of the pool. So this really should be about, 2%. So when we identify those situations, sometimes we go, okay, we can't determine it based on statistics probably because we have a few issues with data, or maybe not enough sites with swimming pools. And so what we're going to do is include the correction, but we're going to use it based on international literature of, what's the average energy consumption of swimming pools. That was a long explanation. Probably Paul can say a lot more about the specifics here, but I just wanted to explain that's what we mean by deemed. It means that we couldn't, based on the data, statistically say it is 3% based on this data set. So what we're going to do is use a model in the literature to refine and be able to include this. Now, Paul, does that?
Paul's put a nice succinct definition in the chat.
Yeah, basically where we've gone to an external benchmark rather than using a benchmark derived from the data set, just typically because as Carlos is saying, because we can't back out anything that looks realistic from the data set. And it's particularly useful where we're dealing with a relatively small factor within a benchmark, but one which we know has to be an impact and which people feel needs to be represented. So we've used it in a number of NABERS ratings, and there are a couple of areas where we're proposing to use it in today's session.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So moving on to the water part of the residential aged care benchmark now. I'll just throw in a reminder on, I guess a few slides ago, we explained that we were roughly running linear regression to cross-check relationships between variables and their impact on energy and water consumption. But as part of that analysis, we're also trying to determine how strong that relationship is, and also doing some statistical analysis to determine whether any differences that we find between a site that has a certain variable and a site that doesn't, how significant it is from a statistical perspective, and is it worthy of correction. So some of the variables that you don't see appear here, which I'll quickly run through in the next few slides. What other variables we considered are those variables that fall within that category, which is we've run additional statistical analysis and found that the difference was not statistically significant at the time. So looking at water here, we're still using the occupied bed days as our primary scaling factor, which is great because that's something that's common with our energy rating tool. And then for water, we also have two secondary corrections. One is cooling degree days, and that largely corrects for sites' cooling requirements. I noticed that there's a question there about heating degree days in the energy benchmarks and why cooling degree days wasn't corrected later on. Essentially, we found that the correlation was quite weak with energy, but with water, it's quite strong. And finally, for the water rating tool, we're still also correcting for the presence of on-site heavy laundry. And in this case, if you process them on site, we'll correct for it. Otherwise, it's off-site. The good thing here is that you see that we don't have any new variables that's been introduced just because we're using the water tool, which means that if you were doing a NABERS rating, your assessor would be able to cover most of the variables and conduct both the energy and water rating at the same time. So next slide. So here are some of the other variables that we analyzed, and it hasn't made it into the final benchmark because we couldn't see statistical significance in them. So for energy, there were quite a few other ones. One, we've got gross floor area. We had cooling degree days, which we found the correlation once we've done all the corrections using the variables I just went through in the previous slides. The residual or remaining unexplained energy or emissions was very weakly explained by cooling degree days. We also looked at site area. We looked at the number of lift floors. We also looked at the weekly meals cooked on site. They're all really weak, and that's probably because with things like weekly meals that are cooked on site, all residential aged care facilities pretty much provide about 3 meals, hot meals a week for residents. We also looked at full-time equivalent workers per OBD, but because they were all provided by a single provider, and we didn't see very strong statistical significance, it was something that we decided not to include in the final benchmark. On the part of water, with residential aged care, we looked at site area. We also looked at gross floor area and the weekly meals cooked on site. Okay, I'll move on to retirement living now.
Grace, is it worth just spending a minute talking a little bit about the questions that Wendy's been asking on the chat about CDD, HDD, and I think I appreciate that a lot of you have not worked with those variables before. So just to explain it, very briefly, cooling degree days and heating degree days are the statistical numbers that represent the climate in a zone. So cooling degree days means that it's hot and there's often a lot of cooling. And heating degree days means that it's a colder region, so it has more hours a year below a certain temperature. So the more heating degree days you have, and if you're in a city like Hobart, for example, you'd have a lot more heating degree days than if you were in Perth or Sydney, or if you were and if you go to Brisbane, it would be less heating degree days. So it's just a statistical number that represents climate, and we use it because we can say, well, what is the impact of climate? That's actually, if you put it theoretically, it's really difficult, but that number allows you to test. Well, are buildings that have more heating degree days or more cooling degree days, do they actually use more energy as a result? So that's what we use them. So we put them in the statistical blender and analysis that we do to test that. And what often happens, and this is not the first tool where that happens, is that we often put both cooling degree days and heating degree days, and they are kind of mirror image. One shows how much, that in hotter climates, you need more and more cooling. And the other one shows that colder climates, you need more and more heating. So they look like this. So if you're in, tropical North Queensland, one would be really high and the other number will be really low. And if you're down in Hobart, the other one will be really high, the one about heating, and the cooling will be much lower. So the reason why we put them both is because we put both variables, knowing that they are very statistically related. Well, one is high, the other one's low. Does that make sense? And we basically go, which one of these two is the one that explains, help us create the benchmark the best. And so sometimes we do this analysis and you get the heating degree days is actually a better variable to use. Sometimes you get cooling degree days. And what happens in this rating tool is that when we did the analysis, in one we identified that heating degree days gave us better statistical correlations. And the other one, cooling degree days, gave us that, but they're very correlated. They're just two different numbers to interpret climate, and so it's a little bit complicated, maybe something that is also worth a separate discussion as well, Wendy. But that's the reason. So we did consider both of those variables in both cases, and then at the end, always one of those two variables drops because they're so correlated. And we usually use the one that is statistically more robust in the analysis. I hope that made some sense. Sorry, Grace. Back to you. And Wendy, we're really happy to talk about it after the meeting as well, if you want to dive a little bit deep into the statistics.
Excellent. Okay, so let's move on to retirement living now. I can see lots of questions coming through. That's all right. We know someone's responding to them. Okay, so next slide. All right, so retirement living. So keeping in mind the coverage of retirement living energy rating tools, where we are really looking at the common facilities energy consumption. Sorry, just have an Excel spread. Yep. So we have the common facilities energy consumption. We also cover any centralized air conditioning or heating systems that is provided to your units. And any general light and power for your, what we consider independent units. So that might be your villas or your townhouses, or indeed even apartments where all the power points and all those are connected to a independent unit, that's excluded. So keeping that in mind, the primary variable that will be used to scale our energy and consumption for a site is the total number of units. And this is basically defined as how many townhouses do you have on site, how many villas do you have on site, how many apartments do you have, regardless of whether you have air conditioning supplied to that apartment or not. So we're just calculating the number of units that are there. Once we scale that as a primary factor, there are a few other secondary variables that we correct for. So the first one is the number of service apartments. We need to take quite a bit of care in how we're defining service apartments within this current rating tool for retirement living. We will later on in the rules section, you'll see the actual words that we'll use to define it. But essentially, service apartments are defined as apartments where the heating and or cooling is supplied through the meter that is included within the rated retirement living energy consumption. So once that's corrected, we also have corrections for site area. And that's partly because the wider your site area, we found that it's quite a strong correlation in terms of increased energy consumption. And finally, we have other services and facilities such as swimming pools. At the moment, we are going to use a swimming pool surface area correction, and similar to how we treated it in residential aged care, we'll be using the deemed surface area correction, in which we're using an external benchmark instead of using the actual kilograms carbon dioxide that is derived from the data set. And finally, we have a correction for the presence of on-site heavy laundry that is conducted on-site. Next slide. Okay. I might have neglected to say the number of sites that we use for this analysis. So for retirement living, we had 146 sites that were provided to us. And in the end, once we did a bit of tidy up, it was 142 sites that was used in the actual benchmark derivation. So moving on to the water rating tool for retirement living. So just a reminder on coverage of water. It includes all of the water consumption going into the site boundary, and that includes any water that's used by your independent units as well. And that was largely because of the common configuration in most sites where you just have a single meter that goes into your whole facility. So using our primary scaling factor, which is total number of units, we then have secondary corrections for site area, whereby site area is quite important secondary correction, as well as the what we call irrigation rate. So the irrigation rate is essentially a climate correction based on data from the Meteorological Bureau. And it essentially tells us how much irrigation is required based on the climate that your site is located in. Okay, next slide.
Grace, Wendy had a question about why we use irrigation instead of in this tool, but not in residential HK.
Sure. So we did actually explore the use of cooling degree days, and we also explored using irrigation rates. And what we found is that the use of irrigation rates provided us with a better correlation compared to water consumption. And we then explored why that might be the case. So it could be due to a few factors. The first is retirement living is typically, their water consumption is typically driven by the need for irrigation, essentially. Whereas cooling degree days is typically an indicator of how much cooling is required. And in the case of when we think about what a residential aged care facility probably looks like, the grounds that they have for the residential aged care facility is probably a lot smaller compared to the retirement living facility. And therefore, the impact, or I guess, or significance of air conditioning, particularly when you're using water-cooled air conditioning, becomes stronger and more significant. And that's why we think that for cooling degree days, residential aged care uses it in a benchmark. And for retirement living, we found that using irrigation rate is a more accurate description of what's happening physically on site. Okay, great. So just moving on to, similar to residential aged care, that little icon in the top right corner should really say retirement living. But essentially, we also explored a lot of other variables to try to determine whether there was anything else that might explain with statistical confidence the energy and water consumption. So for energy, we also looked at the presence of on-site cafes that's available to the general public and whether that had impact on, I guess, the energy consumption. The answer was actually no, we didn't see any statistical significance with that. We also looked at gross floor area. Now, while there was some sort of relationship to it, once we corrected for total number of units, the relationship and correlation or statistical significance of that variable became a lot weaker. In addition to that, you would have seen Paul's comments on the chat where he raises some questionable, I guess, gross floor number area numbers, which we just didn't feel too confident about using within the benchmark. We also looked at cooling degree days and heating degree days for the retirement living energy benchmark, as well as the meals cooked on site per week, in case you had a catering kitchen that is connected to your retirement living energy meter and you cook meals for your retirement living or any other parties from that kitchen. On water, we looked at the presence of on-site heavy laundry where you are processing bed linen or towels for on-site. We also looked at if you had a pool, whether that made a huge impact on your water consumption. We looked at the impact of having an on-site cafe as well as your meals cooked on-site per week. Okay. I might pause here. I know that we've had lots of opportunities to talk through questions. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to ask before I move on to trial ratings?
Hey, how you going? It's Jeff Higgins here from Retire Australia. So I just had a query around like understanding whether certain sites utilise bore water rather than town water for irrigation services, things like that. If that made a difference, or with the rating tools and things like that.
Yeah, so the current NABERS water rating tool is based off imported external potable water. So if you're using bore water or using recycled water, or in fact, if you are recycling your fire water usage, that would tend to improve your water rating. Not sure if anyone else from NABERS might want to add to it.
I don't think, I might need to brush out because I haven't read that specific section of the rule in a little while, but I don't believe that with bore water is correct. Is that right? Super?
That's right. I think we need to separate bore water from recycled water. So bore water is almost considered as an external water supply, and that needs to be included in the rating assessment. So that water use will be included in the rating assessment. Whereas if there is any recycled water, either that is purchased or through like rainwater tanks and the likes, then that again, similar to what happens with solar PV, then that reduces the demand of imported water usage, and then that gets reflected in the star rating. So to answer your question, Jeff, bore water usage will need to be separately metered and then included in the rating assessment. And there is also the case for materiality, so how much of the water use, and maybe that, and that is something that we can look into as part of our rules side of things.
Yeah, and Jeff, as a general note on that, I mean, bore water is just looking at like the principles of NABERS. Using water and has an impact on the environment, right? So we want to encourage sites to be as thrifty as they can and not to waste water. And if we had a loophole where people can just do, use board water in any number of amounts and they would get a great rating because it looks like they have zero water use, that would be a real negative impact. So that's not something we do. So if you're using board water, you need to meter it just like if it was water from the mains. And the water consumption you use on site, the more water you use, the lower your rating will be. But we do encourage people to collect water on site. And if you're collecting water from rainwater, you have tanks, any water you use from that, it's not coming from outside, so it's actually going to improve your rating, if that makes sense.
Yep, understood. Thanks.
Are there any other questions before we start talking about the trial ratings?
I think just a general comment in terms of a lot of the items that perhaps, as mentioned earlier, that we might not have a lot of data that covered a lot of the warmer zones and the likes. Just flagging that we will, once we launch the tool, we will be monitoring how the benchmark's working. So we will, and there are two ways. One is once we get at equal intervals. So once we get maybe 50 ratings or 100 ratings, we will do a check of the rating distribution and how things are tracking. And also we will be asking, as part of the rating assessment, also asking some additional questions where we were not necessarily, where we didn't get good data during the data collection piece, and keeping track of those as well. So that's how that's the intention in terms of how we go about keeping track of how the tool is performing. Just thought I flagged that.
I just had a question. It's Rod Kington here from Grosvenor. I'm a NABERS assessor. It sounds like, so for the two tools, and it's two tools, we're going to go with occupied bed days as a key driver in retirement living, but we're going to go with a different metric in residential aged care, or the other way around?
The other way around.
Other way around. So OBD for aged care and number of units and number of service apartments for retirement living.
So when we ran the stats, we found out that these different minor and differentiators of bed versus apartment versus area, we went with beds. So I also deal with the hotel ratings tool, and it's interesting how beds and apartments divide up. And I haven't been into many aged care. So through aged care, are there dual beds in single apartments? How did that come that we used two different metrics for very similar sort of arranged sites?
I can take that, Rod. For aged care, the setup is quite different, as in we're doing a whole building rating. So these are the rooms which are we counting as occupants in their rooms. And for retirement living, it's more like we might have a 3-bedroom villa and a number of townhouses on a retirement living site. So the number of apartments or the number of villas, or we call it independent dwellings, is what made a difference with the correlation.
And I think, Rod, as a general term on when it comes to particularly like size variables, which is probably the most important side in a NABERS rating, right? Because a lot of the other things we're talking about, climate, might make a 3, 4, 5% difference, but size can make a 10,000% difference between a small building and a very, very large building. So that's a primary variable. But we usually try to get variables that are already collected with high quality data in different sectors. And this is probably one of the key differences we do see how residential aged care is quite different to retirement living, in that, in the residential aged care sector, occupied bed days is a really important variable that all companies collect with relatively high quality of data. There's even some financial transactions that are attached to it. So there is a variable that is collected very systematically. Retirement living, that variable is less important unless you have an aged care component. But the primary variable becomes, how many dwellings do you have? And so we're trying to use a variable that is available, that people can obtain when they're doing a rating, and that can be verified with accuracy. And that's kind of the key reason why we ended up going with different size variables, is because of the nature of data that was available in those two sectors.
How have you allowed, so the NABERS tools are sort of derived to deliver a level of output, you have a level of efficiency, and the level of service is a person, a single person, how much carbon is emitted to support a person in a site. So if we're in a residential living, if we're in the one where it's apartments, it could be a one person in a 3-bedroom apartment using a whole heap of energy. And that's not an efficient way of supporting people in retirement, carbon-wise. And it's a bit like the hotels, that we give them more. If you have a 5-star hotel, we give them more energy to play with, and they're allowed to emit more carbon. Are we going to do, is this the same or are we going to do the same sort of thing in the residential aged care? We're going to allow people to choose to emit more carbon in their aged care, but still demonstrate their energy efficiency for delivering the same unit of care? Sorry, does that make sense?
Yeah, so at this point, we have not had what I would describe as being reliable data on occupancy, as opposed to number of units for retirement living. And so, frankly, we just don't, and the fact that we don't have that data tends to mean that it's not readily available. So there is a practicality aspect of this that, if we can't get the data, we can't benchmark by it. Certainly in the case of the concern that you're raising, if you have a site where it's full of 3-bedroom apartments with one person in them, a per unit correction will not be advantageous to that per unit basis. It would be advantageous to it would be more of a problem if it had lots of 3-bedroom apartments and they all had 3 people in them. But from what we've seen, and other people on this call are more qualified to discuss this than me, but what we've seen actually, a lot of like the majority situation in the retirement living is 1 and sometimes 2. So there's a fairly consistent population base there. So the degree to which it introduces a disparity in the rating at this stage appears small, and as I say, is beyond our level beyond the data we've got at the moment to be able to detect.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just aware of time for you, Suruchi and Grace. If you could whip through the trial ratings update. Over to you, Suruchi.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Firstly, I would like to thank everyone for involvement in trial ratings. Everyone who was involved in trial ratings has been devoting a lot of time with putting those documentation together. We completely appreciate there's a lot of hours you put in to bring us the documentation requested and to arrange all the site visits, which we have been going through recently. So thanks a lot for that. The trial ratings is a really important step in this whole development process because this is where we will be testing our benchmarks, and then whatever we study through our ratings, through this trial ratings, we'll be feeding this back into our benchmarks so that our benchmarks are more accurate. Plus, this will feed into the rules where we are getting some information on what kind of documentation is available and what kind of variables are being already recorded. So, for example, for retirement living, we know they have some data on number of meals provided. So this is all helping us to feed back into rules and make it easier once the rating tool is available. And after the trial rating is completed, you will receive a consolidated report on all the 16 sites which went through rating, on where how things went and which sites being rated what, though this will be completely optional for everyone to make it public or non-public. So we will be coming back to you to ask if you want to make your rating public or non-public. Be assured with that. And each trial rating site will receive NABERS rating certificate and also a rating report. Yeah, so thanks a lot, and we'll go a little bit more deeper into what we have rated, where we are on trial rating with Grace. She'll take us through the diversity and other things on trial rating. Thanks, Grace.
Excellent. Look, as Suruchi indicated, we have selected about 16 sites to conduct this trial ratings at. And what we're trying to do when we go through these sites to ensure that we have some form of diversity across a few types of, I guess, objectives, state, climate, types, so that it can also help to validate some of our benchmark assumptions as well. So on the first image on the left there, you can see that that's a spread of sites that we're conducting trial ratings at. We clearly have lots of New South Wales sites there with 6 sites, but we've got a good representation of Queensland, Victoria, and in fact in WA, ACT and South Australia as well. Probably the only one that's not included in there is Northern Territory. On the right chart there, you can see the types of facilities that we're conducting trial ratings at. Yes, thanks, Carlos, and thanks, Radio, that we missed out. That we're conducting trial ratings that includes a more or less even spread of residential aged care facilities, retirement living facilities, and then co-located sites, which just means that you have your aged care facility and retirement living within the same site boundary. Next slide. In addition to that, what we tried to select our sites based on, I guess, going on from that breakdown that I provided you just before, a mix of sites which are vertical and horizontal facilities is probably more relevant for retirement living. Sites with and without pools, sites with and without on-site catering kitchens, sites with and without on-site heavy laundry processing facilities. We also looked at sites with and without service apartments. You will see the actual definition of service apartments in the rules section, but currently defined as apartments which have air conditioning systems, including heating, that's connected downstream of your meter that you included in your rated consumption. Independent living units ranging from about 50 to 360 units, so relatively small to probably on the larger side based on the data that we've got. Site area categories where we have sites ranging from only being about 9,000 square meters all the way to 270 square meters, as well as gross floor area. Even though we're not using it, we had sites that, you know, range from 10,000 square meters to more than 40,000 square meters. For residential aged care facilities, we looked at sites with offering between 70 to 160 places. Now that's different from occupied bed days, which is the metric used to scale our benchmark. The providers were across 11 providers, so it gives us a good indication of what's being offered out there and whether your facilities are treated fairly under the benchmark. Next slide. So far we've got 16 sites total. We've had a team of assessors that conducted site visits in Queensland, New South Wales and ACT. In general, I've been quite pleased to see with the first co-located sites that we attended, both the retirement living and residential aged care component of that facility was separately metered. We've seen a vertical complex that has been visited recently, and what we found was that it's a site where a lot of the consumption to the units themselves are separately submetered, which means that we can actually then exclude it, and that site had a pool as well. We've also looked at an aged care facility where there was, I guess, that what Wendy has raised before, where they had an on-site catering kitchen, but it was used for reheating purposes only. So at this stage, as I've mentioned, the way we'll treat that facility is no meals catered on site. We also had sites with heavy laundry processing facilities, but all in all, I think it's been quite positive in seeing that a lot of what we see on site can be treated quite fairly, and we're using it to inform the rules as well. So we have another 60 minus 4, 12 more sites to go. So I have assessors conducting site visits across the next 2 weeks, and we'll be getting a lot more insight from the Victorian sites and more of the Queensland sites as well as South Australia and Western Australia.
We are now going to start talking about the rules, and we're really looking for your input again in this area. So I guess I will hand over again to Grace.
Sorry, I'll just jump in very quickly with just a bit of context. So I think just setting the context for the next discussion. So the rules is really a document for our independent accredited assessors who will be doing the rating assessments. And it provides the details of the data required, the quality of the data required, and also the supporting evidence required for rating assessments. And this is also something that we check as part of the certification process is really the compliance with the rules for most parts. And the purpose of having rules is to really ensure that all buildings are accurately, fairly, and consistently treated. And the other intention is to also essentially strike the right balance between accuracy and feasibility. So while we want the data collected and used for rating assessments to meet a certain level of accuracy, we also want it to be something that is fairly easily available and accessible by the providers and by extension to the assessors, so that it's not something that is super time, budget, or resource intensive. And this is also the feedback that we've got from our experienced assessors on the panel, looking at you, John. Cool, so I think on that, I think I'll now hand over to Grace, and I'll also share my slide. Go for it, Grace.
Excellent. All right, so next slide, please. So as Supra has indicated, the actual rules will be a document, usually probably about 50 pages long, 30 to 50 pages long, covering how every single variable will be treated, the documentation that's required, and that's to ensure that every assessor, accredited NABERS assessor that goes out there is actually collecting data and using variables in the same way within the benchmark itself or the rating tool itself. So, so the first thing I'm going to go through is I'm going to go through 2 slides that tells you for residential aged care and retirement living, the key components of the rules. I will pause there. And then after that, we'll go through the actual definitions. And that first pause I'm going to go through would just be an opportunity for you to say, hey, you should consider defining this as well. And then we'll just take note of that before we move into the actual definitions. So firstly, for residential aged care, we'll be covering a very important variable, which is occupied bed days. And we'll also include the description of how you calculate that. In addition to that, we'll also cover the heated swimming pool surface area and the presence of on-site heavy laundry, how that is defined and the information that's required. I have there on item 4 under consideration, that probably won't make it in the end, but that was full-time equivalent workers. Then other than that, we'll have rules and text around how you define your 12 months of energy consumption, the information that's required, where you don't have the information, how you might treat that. And the energy coverage of that would include treatment of electricity, natural gas, LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, diesel, treatment of any green power that you might be purchasing, as well as on-site renewables, so on-site solar. Item number 6, we have 12 months of water consumption, which covers all water consumption to site. There was already some discussion earlier on about potable water, bore water, recycled water, so those will be covered. And finally, if you had sub-meters for non-residential aged care usage, so for example, where you might have a co-located sites at the moment, what are requirements around the sub-meters that you can use for the rating. Okay, so for retirement living, the rules will cover the number of units and how that is defined and calculated during the rating period, the number of service departments, site area, the number of meals that are cooked on site per week, heated pool, surface area, and we'll be getting the assessors to define where it's indoor or outdoor. The definition of the presence of heavy laundry processing facilities. Again, on item 7, it was there previously under consideration that likely won't make it into the final benchmark, which is gross floor area. With item 8 and 9, that's the same as what I went through with residential aged care. It's basically your 12 months energy and water consumption and its different sources. And of course, the sub-metered consumption. All right, so I might just pause here. If you just go back a slide, Supra. I'll just pause here to get some feedback from participants to see if there's anything additional that you thought might be worthwhile including in the rules.
Hi Grace, it's Martin here from Blue Cross. Just with aged care, I was just a bit concerned about reference to heavy laundries, and you talked about bed linen, because at our sites, the bed linen is actually done outside, but we do all the personals inside. And they operate every day with quite large industrial dryers and washing machines, but in the description of what you're including, it doesn't mention those.
Yeah, so it's probably something I should have covered during benchmarking. When we did the statistical analysis, we actually cross-checked the impact of statistical significance of personal laundry being done on site, off-site, as well as heavy laundry done on site and off-site. And what we found was that with personal laundry, there was no statistical significance in terms of that difference, probably because most sites do that. But with heavy laundry, that was certainly something that we saw in terms of statistical impact. And so that's why with the personal laundry, it's not something that is included in here, but we'll certainly make sure that heavy laundry definition is clear. And we'll go through that in the next few slides.
So I just wanted to be clear, when you say personal laundry, I'm talking about all the residents' clothes being washed in industrial machines. We're not just talking about small washing machines for residents to use. So that's what you're referring to? I'm
referring to heavy laundry like linen, towels.
I'm just talking about the use of the industrial appliances for washing residents' clothes.
So
they operate every day.
The industrial, so I mean, presumably, because we're talking about aged care here, presumably the clothes are either washed in domestic scale machines or in industrial scale machines. The industrial scale machines actually have typically a slightly higher efficiency overall than the domestic ones. That because ultimately within aged care, that is actually happening in most sites, because I assume relatively few sites send personal laundry off-site for processing. It means that we've got no differentiation. We can't, basically, because everybody does it to some extent or other, we can't really tell the difference. Whereas with the heavy laundry, the linen, some sites do that on site, some sites don't. So it becomes a variable that we can use.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So there was the next slide of retirement living. Great. So Peter, you've raised that in some retirement villages, the solar power is present. So that would be covered under the 12 months energy consumption. Yeah. So it'll cover on-site generation and treatment. Okay. If there's no other general comments about coverage of the rules, we move on to the actual definitions now. So I only have 5 key variables that would require a definition. And part of that is because things like pool surface area, heavy laundry being processed on site or off site, your number of meals that's cooked weekly on site, those are common across your 2 rating tools. So the first one here is occupied bed days. This is used for residential aged care only. This is currently defined as a measure of the number of beds that's occupied across the rating period, which is your 365 days or 366 days. This definition is actually consistent with how the hospital's rating tool, NABERS is a hospital's rating tool, defines occupied bed days. So it has allowance for how you treat full-time residency as well as partial. So if you have a bed that's not occupied 365 days, there's a way to treat that. So I just leave you to read that for a short while. And then you see there are some focus questions on the bottom. So the very first question is whether that calculation procedure that's being described on the screen that you see, does that align with current practice in terms of how you collect your data? And secondly, what documentation, so that we can actually include that in the rules as documentation, is available for this record, including, you know, what you would name it.
Grace, it's John DeAngelis here from Lutheran Services. You'll find most residential aged care providers will have the exact number of occupied bed days for any given period available. So for example, if we've got 100 beds in a residential aged care facility and the reporting period is 365 days, that's 365,000 days available. Mm-hmm. Throughout the whole year, we track occupied bed days. So we'll be able to provide the exact number of occupied bed days in that given reporting period rather than applying a formula. I know that's probably what you're saying in the formula. You'll find that most aged care providers will have that information because they use it to track and to rank and to apply some sort of standardization to their numbers to be able to compare against industry.
That's great. So currently the rules are still in draft form at the moment. Essentially, it also says that if you have your occupied bed days documentation, that you provide an accompanying document just to reference how you've actually calculated that number, and if it aligns with, roughly speaking, what the concept of what's being presented on the screen here, then that would be accepted by the assessor. But it'd be really good if we could have some text around that. If this needs to be, again, it's ensuring that all NABERS assessor across Australia is applying the same method and also assessing the documentation they received in the same method, particularly since it's a primary factor.
Sure.
Grace, I would get a couple more people from aged care to get their view as well. Martin, can I put you on spot and have your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think John summed it up pretty well. We track occupancy on a daily basis. It's normally sort of related as a percentage of the beds available, but that's easily equated to bed days. So yeah, it's tracked on a very, very closely. We're running on the smell of an oily rag these days, so everything counts.
Do you agree with that formula that's there, or do you think it could be, I guess, refined or text or clarification?
It's a fairly simple formula. I think it speaks for itself. It's easy.
Yeah.
Michael here from Bolton Clark. Yeah, we use the same formula. I think it's a pretty standard kind of way for us, all of us in aged care, to do this. Makes it nice and easy.
That's great. Thanks.
Perfect.
So I see that John has raised some comments regarding partial residence and the potential for sites that don't track OBD daily. So he's proposed that we could use a percentage occupancy which is converted to OBD. Does anyone have any comments based on that?
I'll just say you just got to make sure you have the occupancy each day because it does change very quickly.
Okay. Great. Okay. In terms of documentation, is there a term that we could use or reference in the rules that is common across industry?
Occupied bed days is pretty standard.
Okay. All right.
I've worked for 3 different aged care providers and healthcare, and we all use exactly the same thing.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Well, then let's move on to our next variable here. Next slide. So we're switching gears to retirement living. So with retirement living, remember, and it's very wordy here, so I'll give you a lot more time to read it, but number of units, which is a reflection of all types of units. If you have a villa, that's 1 unit. If you have a townhouse, that's 1 unit. If you have 1 apartment that's been offered, regardless of number of bedrooms, it's 1 unit. And that will apply for service departments as well. So there are 4 wordy definitions there. We describe what a townhouse is. We describe what a villa is, which is a freestanding house. We define what an apartment is versus what a serviced apartment is. And I'll spend a bit more time again just explaining serviced apartments. So with serviced apartments, for the purposes of the retirement living rating tool, is defined as apartments where the air conditioning services, which could be heating and or cooling, are part of your metered consumption coverage. And what that means is that whatever meter that air conditioning system is downstream of is included in your rated energy. There's some text around the two other sentences at the end of the serviced apartments definition. They're just there as context. They're saying that usually serviced apartment residents may experience a higher level of care. Of course, that differs from provider to provider. And that level of care may include laundry service, meals, or increased levels of personal care. But the key definition for serviced apartments is defined as the air conditioning services. So the focus question, once you had a chance to read through all the text, is just to review the definitions for each of those and provide any feedback if any changes should be made.
I'm going to ask, sorry, yeah, Rod, go ahead.
I was going to say, Grace, the definitions are good, but you talk about energy consumption is independently metered. It depends whether you use the word independently metered, utility metered, whether it's a embedded network. That's going to create significant challenges for delivering these ratings, depending on the definitions that you apply. So if you pull the standard 128-page rules around energy and water metering and apply that to these sites, I haven't been to any of the sites, so I don't know how they do their dispersal of electricity on site. I'm sure they still have to comply to legislative rules in their own states. But there's going to be challenges around validation, sub-metering, valid sub-metering, billing, and all those type of things.
Okay, thanks, Rod.
I just add there that I think in most cases we've tried to align the definitions with the common facility, the common metering arrangements that we're seeing that would work most easily. So we've tried to align it with effectively what is most simply obtained. That's not going to say that that's going to be perfect, but it's it is a diverse sector in terms of metering configuration.
And I know this is not easy, doesn't make it easy necessarily, Rod, but the good thing about the arrangements that we've seen in the sites where we have data and the pilots that we've done is that when it comes to energy provision, all the arrangements we've seen have been kind of combinations of arrangements we've seen in other sectors. Again, in retirement living, it's often been, kind of like the base building condition we have in offices or shopping centers. Sometimes there's embedded networks, but there've been cases that we actually have addressed in other rating tools. Obviously, some sites are going to be very straightforward because the arrangement is very common, and some of them might require might be a little bit trickier, but I don't think we've seen from that perspective any case that we haven't really addressed and tested significantly in the past through other rating tools.
I think the most significant source of potential sub-metering will be sites that have a single gate meter and sub-meter to the units. And we have the advantage there that those sub-meters would be single phase, non-CT meters. And as a result, they don't require any calibration or validation. So in the most common case, I suspect, it is purely a matter of arithmetic rather than a complex validation exercise.
Because it's retirement living, I think I'll ask a couple of providers to agree with the definitions, Grace. Kalpesh, can I get your thoughts, please?
Sure, and look, really just echo the comments already raised. I think energy in its definition is both electricity and probably thermal energy as well. So if there's centralized hot water services compared to individual services, what's in and what's out in that respect. And water in that respect is also either gross metered at the site level or it can be independently at the villa level or the service department level. In terms of the definitions between both the town houses and villas, Look, I think that reads well. The only thing I would say is in terms of low level of care, essentially they are independent living units, so residents are independent. The level of care there is more just that there is centralized facilities that are available to those residents living within a community. So there's not necessarily any energy consumed in relation to a kind of a care service attached to that townhouse or the villa.
Yeah, thanks, Kalpesh. Peter or Jeff, one of you, could you please also give your thoughts on this?
Yeah, for our portfolio, it's right in line with one embedded network. But you know, we can work that out fairly easily. The rest of it, I think you've got covered. You know, particularly with the service departments and so forth, because if there is any sharing of hot water and so forth, that's where it's done in our portfolios for the service departments. The rest of it's independent living and independently metered.
Sure, thanks, Peter.
Okay, so I'll just quickly summarize the key. Sorry, just jump on the previous slide. What I'm hearing from this is for townhouses, villas, and townhouses and villas, I will probably remove that sentence that says they receive low levels of care and class as largely independent living. That's probably just confusing. Additional words that doesn't really help. And with service departments, we'll also, pending some of these findings from our trial ratings, probably add in hot water as well, domestic hot water. Okay, next slide, please. So we've covered the primary scaling factors, and it's fantastic to hear we don't hear any major outrage on them. Now we can move on to sort of the secondary factors now. So site area is currently only, that's, well, I'm actually pause here. So seller has,
sorry, Grace.
Yeah.
Can I ask Stephen from RFPI? He has some issue with one of the, I think, definition.
Yes.
Stephen, yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry for the S-Elliot, it's Stephen. In regards to the industry going forward, and there might be some comments from some of the other care providers, we're seeing a trend, a growing trend, between what you would traditionally have called a retirement village and a residential aged care facility. There will be some middle ground in future that's going to be quasi aged care facility, but in retirement villages, and that's what we're terming as assisted living. What you will see is people that are living independently gradually over time receive care, probably from care services like nursing care, etc., but staying in their own independent living apartment. So you're going to see a middle ground between those two emerge, and that's a trend that will continue over the next millennium, because people want to stay living in their own homes, yet receive services aging in place. How are you going to deal with that in the NABERS modelling?
Can I ask a question in relation to that? How would they be tracked in terms of the OBD? Would they be included in an OBD figure? Would they excluded in an OBD figure? How would that be handled?
No, occupied bed days is specific to an aged care facility. It's not tracked in residential, retirement living. It's similar to a service department, but you're receiving care services in a retirement village environment. And so we do see this as an emerging sector, and it's going to be the middle ground between your two models.
Well, at the moment, one of the ways that we're dealing with that is, for instance, by looking at the services that are provided, and particularly the energy and water consuming services, and what's come up there is meals as one of the key factors. I'm chronically aware of this because actually my mother sits in exactly that situation. You know, there are meals provided to some extent and higher levels of meals available. And so we've endeavored to pick that up. It's really, the question that we have to ask, and it's a very valid question, is how much does that additional level of care affect the energy and water use?
Yeah.
So as I say, we've picked up on the laundry variable and the meals variable. Be very open to any suggestions of other areas where we should be looking that might pick that up.
Yes, it's just the interesting factor that probably their energy and water consumption will increase as their acuity levels increase and require more in-home care and services. But I'm just not sure how you're going to reflect that. That's all.
Yeah, that's a very difficult one because of the it being a continuous variable. As people become more dependent, what's the rate of, how do you measure dependency? But to some extent also, if, for instance, meals is a reasonable starting point as a tracking variable for dependency, then what will happen is that we can use that as a test variable that cross correlates with the other items. And what we've found so far is not significant in terms of being able to pick that up, but it's a very valid question.
Okay, thank you.
John, I think you said something, but I think we missed it. Are you still there? No, I think he might have been saying that he has to go for a short while and he'll be back. There was another question from Peter, or another comment. Peter, I was wondering if you wanted to say it out loud.
Yeah, just on the meals, meals coming out of the kitchens from the service departments, they're tracked for the numbers that go to the independent unit living for residents. So you can still that will come out of the numbers that your electricity and water and so forth are coming out of your kitchen. And yeah, look, I agree that that's going to be the middle ground, because the offering of home care is going to be a very, very large player in our industry. What that does to the energy use, that will be something to be mindful of. But also, I think that we just got to be careful. There may be some privacy issues around asking people just exactly what's happening in their independent living unit as well.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think what I would say to both those comments, and maybe going back to Steve's comment at the beginning about trends in markets, and I think this is, I mean, we've heard this comment a couple of times before, and it's good to see that everyone thinks that this is a trend that will continue. One of the challenges with early trends is that you don't have a lot of data, often to benchmark, say, the impact of this is 25% energy consumption. To be able to do that, you often need a significant portion of the market to be there in a significant capacity. And so often it might be the kind of thing that that we need to track early on. And we can definitely make changes to ratings to include additional variables that we didn't have on day one. And I think that's something that is good to keep in mind, because this is one trend that we are aware of now. But in 5 years, there could be another trend that we're not aware of. And that's happened in NABERS a couple of times in the past. And often what we do is to go, okay, this variable or this factor was identified that we didn't think about, or we didn't have data 5 years ago. We have data now. Let's look at let's collect a bit more data. Let's run some stats. What's the impact? Oh, sites that have this or don't have this, it makes a 15% difference in energy consumption. Okay, well, we have enough data now that we can collect it and introduce maybe a new variable that we didn't have before. So in some of this crossover between aged care and retirement living, and having like sort of like a blend on the retirement villages side, is something that we can track. And when we can have enough sites to quantify that, we can say, okay, what do we measure? What's the impact of that? And when we have that, we can introduce a section in the rules. So the rating tool can be flexible like that. And I think our goal for when we release a new tool is that it really works for like 95% of sites. I think that's great. There's always going to be a 1 or 2% of sites that are very unusual, or maybe connected to a big site that is completely different. There's always like some fringe on the fringes. It gets a little bit tricky. But if we can start with a tool that works for most cases, then we can start tackle systematically some of the cases that are a little bit more unusual, and trends that are a little bit more difficult to quantify early on. Thanks, Steve.
Look, I'm also conscious of time, and I guess your valuable time, really. We have another 4 variables to go through. The next one for site area is probably the trickiest. If you do find that you've got really strong thoughts, or even suggestions that you didn't manage to raise during this session, please post them in the chat, or it would be really ideal if you could email them across to the NABERS team, which hopefully will pass on to me quite quickly, or you can always contact myself directly as well if you like. So for site area, currently defined as the total horizontal area, so it's basically just looking on one plane on the x-axis, the horizontal plane, of the site from the site boundary, so boundary to boundary, which excludes any public access strips, community land, and public spaces. Essentially, if I had to dumb that down, it's basically the land that you own or your facility owns. That definition should be aligned with some of the, I think it was New South Wales, Victoria, or Queensland definitions where they define site area. But if there's anything that you think is unclear, please feel free to post that. Now, sources of documentation, as far as we're aware at the moment, could be your state land title registry, where you'll have a site area listed on it. It sometimes is not in square meters, it might be in hectares. That seems to be quite common, so that's okay, because yes, I'm sure can translate that to square meters. Other sources may be legal surveys that's been done by a surveyor. They might call that as different names in different states. It could be called a registered plan or a deposited plan. What I can see so far is that such titles, if you've never heard of them or never seen them, may be available from a couple of websites. So there's a website called propertyregistry.com.au, which allows you to search for any title across Australia, except ACT apparently. And for about $50, you can buy a title for your site that should include that survey. Alternatively, in the ACT, there's the ACT Land Information System. It's about $29 in the ACT, a similar sort of information. So the focus question here is really about when you think about, I guess, your own application and how you might define it and your difficulties, just what are the data sources maybe available for the site area? What are you thinking about that? Next slide. So here's we just thought we'd show you an example of something that was taken from Suruchi or Supra. It was from Property Registry, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, even though, Grace, we've got many more, like more than 10 sites. They are government brokers, authorized brokers, where you can obtain those title search information.
Sure.
Yeah.
So essentially, this is just an example of a documentation that's official, which would be accepted as part of NABERS. And you can see highlighted in yellow right in the middle there, it tells you what the hectares, 7.142 hectares is the site area. And it shows you where the boundary of the sites are, and it also draws out sort of like the separately titled sites. So I might jump back to the previous slide and open that up for a bit of discussion here. With the information we provided to you,
and this is relevant to retirement living, not to aged care, because we will be collecting site area in terms of retirement living.
Can I take the general lack of engagement as that you got the memo, or that?
I think John had a question on the chat.
Look, I was just going to ask, a lot of providers have got co-located facilities where the boundaries between residential aged care and retirement living aren't exactly defined. So we're going to have to make some sort of, judgment call on what area we're going to allocate to the retirement village if we're trying to capture total horizontal area of the retirement village alone.
Yeah, it's a good point, John. And I don't know if we've done that analysis, but we actually have in our rules for all the other sectors, we have this a ruling about shared facilities. And we first created it because of Brian Guru. I'm not sure if there's anyone from Lend-Lease here, but Brian Guru created a huge problem for us because everything's shared. And then obviously it's not the only place where that happened, but we've been testing it quite a bit since, because Brian Guru has been around for quite a few years now. But we have never tested that with in this particular configuration. So I think it's you know, a quick thing that we could do is to look at to what extent that can be applied. And it literally is just a methodology to is something that is shared, like a car park, and how much is allocated to each side. So that could be potentially extended to this. Paul and Grace, do you have any thoughts on that methodology?
Yeah, I mean, there's particularly with combination co-located sites, there is a process that we will be going through to look at how to combine ratings to deal with that situation, recognizing that there are a significant number of co-located sites. At the simplest level, you know, my feeling is, for instance, with site area, if you have a large co-located site, well, site area only appears in one of the ratings, but the site area that we're interested in is determined by the irrigation. And so we start actually picking out what the, you know, irrigated area is out of the site area, and those sorts of considerations. But I think what you point out, and what a number of the other comments in the chat point out, is the need to work through particularly exclusions to make sure that those are appropriately defined and sensibly defined, because there's all sorts of issues that can come up there, and would be pushing fairly strongly to keep the exclusions to the bare minimum necessary to maintain a fair rating because of that.
I might drop in sort of 2 additional notes to that as well. So you would have seen that in our trial ratings, we have a good sample of co-located sites, and we're really testing our theory of, you know, are they independently metered? So the site that I went to in ACT, where I'm based, actually had separate water meters for the residential aged care component and the retirement living component. So it's very easy for us to sort of draw the boundary. We recognize that in some sites, it's not always the case, but you only have single meter going right into the site. So we're trying to validate that across the other sites that we're looking at as part of trial ratings as well. And as Paul pointed out, it's something we're actively working on at the moment with the co-located sites. With John, John's comment on site areas, just to be clear, we're defining any, the area is the area that's land owned by the body corporate and actually that's sort of like a strata of that location, as opposed to public land, which is owned by government. So, you know, and remembering how we're using site area here is really regarding irrigation, as that's a key component of it. So assume that if it's government land, you probably don't need to irrigate it. Okay, so next slide. So I reckon the next 3 variables will be relatively straightforward. If you've got any concerns about them, just drop them in to us on the chat or to NABERS if we don't get to go through your comments this session. So number of meals cooked weekly on site is relevant to both retirement living and residential aged care. With kitchen meals, I noted earlier comments about the need to differentiate between reheating and what the actual hot meal actually comprises. So we'll take that into account in our definition. If you've got suggestions around wording, please post them on the chat. But the key things here is the formula regarding kitchen meals equals to your total meals that's cooked per year, divided by the days in a rated period. So that's usually 365 days or 366 days. And then we're actually reconverting that back to a weekly value. So a quick question to everyone here, does the calculation procedure align with current practice and what documentation might be available? So we might only spend maybe about a minute or 2 on this.
Hi, Grace. I was just looking at this and I was just wondering how we'd calculate this. For me, it's totally related to occupancy in aged care. If you've got a resident and you're cooking 3 meals a day, that's the way I'd be working it out.
Yep. So if you had residential aged care and you were only catering for residents on site, if it's 3 meals a day, that's a perfectly valid way. So we might actually clarify that in the rules as well.
It could actually be directly related to the OBDs.
Yeah, there's actually a few sites where I've really been to where that particular kitchen in that aged care facility also cooks meals for non-residential aged care residents, and that's why it was quite important to reflect the total meals cooked on site so that they can cover any external meals they're catering for as well. Okay, so meals is a weekly, so what actually goes into the rating is a weekly value. All right, I might move on to the next variable. So the next variable is your heated swimming pool surface area. If you recall, I mentioned that with pool surface area, we're using our DEEM corrections, which means that we're using an external benchmark. The most important information that needs to go into the rating is what the surface area of it is. So this is basically a definition for swimming pools or spas that are heated for at least 6 months during the rating period. So if your swimming pool or spa is not rated, not heated, sorry, then at the moment this doesn't allow for it. So for each heated pool, what the assessor needs to do is to actually measure the surface area that's exposed in normal operation. So this definition is actually modeled of what we have for other rating tools, such as hotels and apartments that also have swimming pool surface area corrections in their benchmarks. So that documentation wise, you can use site plans, or if that is not available, then the assessor will need to take their tape measure or string and do the measurements to get your site area, sorry, your swimming pool surface area.
This is for retirement living. We doing the pool surface area will be in a variable. So Peter, would you or Jeff, any comments on that? That should be pretty straightforward to get that swimming pool surface area.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a problem.
It's the easiest thing in the world to get.
Yeah,
easiest.
Okay.
It is a breeze.
Would you agree?
That's the easiest thing to get in a hotel or anywhere.
Right.
You've got to go on site anyway, you'll get it. You don't even have to ask beforehand or even mention you need to get it. Doing the site audit, you'll pick up the data.
Perfect. Yeah. Do you agree, Kalpesh?
Look, I'd say the same. Obviously, some of our pools aren't exactly square or rectangular, but it's not a difficult measure to get. The only thing I would say is, does that also pick up temperature of pools? I know you mentioned spa there, but things like hydrotherapy pools or pools that elevate temperatures, is there a differentiation of that in terms of how pool areas are rated?
We don't have that differentiator at the moment. We know that there's much more, there's some differences, but again, we're working off, I guess, the data that we've got, and we've seen that there's a huge difference between having a pool and not having a pool. So we'll start with that primary correction. Okay.
I think we'll go as we study the benchmarks further with more data, and we'll, adjust it further.
Sorry, just the only other comment there is this is for heated pools. So for non-heated pools, obviously the energy rate with filtration and pumping and the rest of it, that's just obviously picked up as part of just electricity consumed at the meter level, and that's how you're treating it.
Yep, at the moment, yes. As part of the trial ratings for providers that are participating, I've actually asked our assessors to do both of them, just so that we can actually then test it again. So we are actually still looking at those variables just to confirm there's no major differences there as part of trial ratings. Okay, so this final variable that I'll quickly run through before James will wrap up. So this is the presence of on-site heavy laundry services. At the moment, this is almost like a yes or no, just because of the data that we've received to date seems to indicate you don't actually measure, for example, kilograms of heavy laundry that's done. So we just have to stick with whether you have it or you don't have it. So heavy laundry is defined as bed linens and towels. They tend to be heavier, and then therefore they tend to consume more energy and water. This heavy laundry service must be within your premises. So if you do it off-site, then there's no specific correction for it within the benchmark. And again, reiterating, is only for towels and or bed linen. Again, with this definition here, is actually modeled of what we already have for hotels. So it's a part of the NABERS rating tools suite. And again, it's just ensuring consistency in treatment across them.
I am going to ask that if you have any comments on this last one, if you could send that through either in the chat as we've run out of time, and we'll try and answer it today. Otherwise, of course, feel free to send us through an email or call or whatever. And with that, thank you very much, Grace. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Sruchi.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, James, and thanks, Grace. Thanks a lot. I'm going to talk very quickly about the next steps and hand it over to Sarah, who will talk about the launch of the writing tools and how you can get your writing started. This is a great journey we are all into. So the first thing I'll talk about is Assessor Training. So basically all training, which will be online, will be available from June onwards. And we will circulate all the information about the training once it's available closer to the date. For the very first assessors who would like to train, it could be from your organization if you would like to get someone trained as an assessor, or yourself. The introductory fee will be very minimal, although there is a prerequisite course. So once the information is available, we really encourage you to please circulate around in the industry for anyone, any industrial professional who will be interested in getting trained as an assessor for this sector, both residential aged care and retirement living. I think I'll pass on to Sarah. Sarah is a sector lead for NABERS, and she has been involved in a couple of more tools launch, apartment buildings and hotel. So she will be taking you through to the next steps for the launch. Sarah.
Sruchi. Yep. All right, keeping it nice and brief. All of you getting the trial ratings will receive your certificates. So we want to be able to help you celebrate your rating. There's going to be an info session around the launch date where we're going to give you a bit of a online workshop kind of ideas for how you can build and embed the ratings into your sustainability strategy and kind of what you can do with it. And really just try to push that two-pronged approach of measure, rate every year, but also working on next steps to improve. And so you can kind of have a really nice demonstrated case study of getting a rating, doing improvements, getting another rating, and then just being able to easily and clearly demonstrate performance wins. And then, apologies about that. And that's about it. So ratings are available from July 1, but I'll pass on to Jess to help us with how to find what you can do once you get a rating, especially with the New South Wales government funding opportunities.
Taco loves it, Sarah. He's a Labrador. Sarah's got a nice puppy. Jess, over to you.
Thanks to Richie and Sarah, and yet Taco's obviously very excited about this meeting. So I'll quickly take you guys through the New South Wales Energy Saving Scheme. I'll keep it really brief because we've only got a few minutes left. But basically, the high-level things that you need to know about this is from August this year, the residential aged care and retirement living sector is being included in the New South Wales Energy Saving Scheme. So this means that if you're a New South Wales, emphasis on New South Wales, rack roll building, and your first NABERS rating is 3.5 stars or higher, you can actually make money off your rating. Obviously, it's a bit more complex than I've probably just explained, but if you'd like to know more about it, check out our fact sheet. Otherwise, contact us directly at NABERS and we can explain it to you more. And there's also similar schemes in Victoria and South Australia. So yeah, reach out if you have any questions, but I'll pass it back over to Sruchi or James.
Thank you, Jess, Sarah, Taco, and Sruchi. So that brings to a close. I find myself in need of some kind of ceremonial gavel once again. That brings to a close the third and final advisory panel for residential aged care and retirement living. That doesn't sort of mean that this is over between you and NABERS. I'd like to think this is just the start of a new and exciting journey, or the continuation for many of you who are already working with us. So thank you very much for your involvement. Thank you for your continued involvement and your time and your energy today. I think we were able to answer most of the questions really well, so thank you, team. But if there are other questions, we are here and we are around. Sarah's job as sector lead is to actually work with you once it's live, which it obviously isn't yet. Until then, Super and Saruchi and myself, we're all here. So anything you need, any questions you have, please get in contact with us. And thank you very much.